are we? Where are we going? Stop for a second, because we should not gloss over those questions. I know you have your listening ears on and your brain tuned in to hear a sermon. Good. I'm asking you for a few seconds to think this morning, where do those questions take you? Who are we? Where are we going? Or perhaps the question should be, who should we be? And where should we be going? There are dozens of people in this room, and I would imagine that there are dozens of different ideas bouncing around in answer to these questions. So then the question becomes, how do we maintain a unified body when we all have so many answers to the same simple questions? Who are we? And where are we going? That's what I've been pondering this week. How do we manage to maintain unity despite our differences? And in fact, how do we grow stronger in unity because of them? Our unity and our strength as a church should be based upon our recognition of our differences and a celebration of those differences. That is, if we are to be the church that God would have of us. And growth, numerical growth, is not our primary goal. Our goal, when it is unity in the Spirit and strength through our diversity, our goal will naturally cause growth, both spiritual and numerical. I guarantee it. Trust me and try me on that one. For what other reason has God brought me here than this? We are continuing our sermon series titled Family Ties this morning with a lesson I call Bridging the Generations to Create a Strong Family and Church. It is a long name, a long title, but a relatively straightforward idea. And it's basically this. We are a multi-generational church made up of multi-generational families, and we must lean into and embrace that fact. If we do, we will grow. If we don't, we will dwindle and die. That means this, though. We must listen to, appreciate, and fully and faithfully incorporate the viewpoints of all generations in order to find strength in our diversity and growth in our strength. We can otherwise adopt and dictate the viewpoint of just one generation, but that leads to the shedding of other generations from this church, and we don't want that. We want the wisdom and faithfulness that comes from age and the vitality and optimism of youth. Listen to me, this is not a zero-sum game. We don't have to trade one for the other. We can have both. So we are talking this morning about generational differences. And before I get any further into this lesson or even this series, I want to point out a generationally relevant reference that has been staring you in the face since Mother's Day. And I wonder if you've picked up on it. It's the name of this series, Family Ties. Who is old enough in spirit but young enough in heart to remember that TV show with Alex P. Keaton, played by Michael J. Fox? It played for 7 years during the 1980s and took up 1/2 hour of each week of my childhood. If you remember it, do you remember the opening credits with the hand painting the portrait of the family? Allow me this morning to give credit to Jared Shipley this morning for his phenomenal job he does preparing the slide themes for all the different series we've been going through. Jared, I don't know how much knowledge he had of the show Family Ties, if any, but I sent him a clip of the opening credits and he came up with these great slides. So thank you, Jared. And for those of you younger than 45, now you at least know the pop culture reference being made here. But let me tell you, the name Family Ties means so much more than a TV show. Last week, we discussed the cord of 3 strands that can bind a strong marriage together. And this week, we're talking about tying the generations together to strengthen the whole. This sermon series is not just about family, it is meant to be about how to make the family stronger, to watch it thrive and grow. This goes both for your family at home and as well as the family in this building right now. We cannot, we must not be content with the status quo. We can do better. We can always do better. Think of this church like a mature oak tree. We must cultivate our roots, appreciate the age in this church, and then rely upon those roots to pull the nutrients from the soil, to send those nutrients to the tree canopy so that it can grow. Likewise, church, if we lose our leaves, we will die. The leaves, the youth, take in the sunshine and are responsible for the photosynthesis that feeds the entire tree. If we get to the point where we are no longer taking in the energy which the leaves provide us, we are ready to be chopped down and used for the fire. We work together. This sermon this morning is only the first word on how to do that better. We are only scratching the surface this morning. This is only meant to start a dialogue that we must each take part in continuing it. From his letter to Titus in chapter 2, Paul said this: "You, however, must teach what is appropriate to sound doctrine. Teach the older men to be temperate, worthy of respect. Likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live. Then they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure. Similarly, encourage the young men to be self-controlled." To Timothy, Paul said this: "Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity." And laying the foundation for advice like that given to Titus, the writer of Proverbs calls forth an observance of the wisdom that would follow in that book when he wrote this: "Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. They are a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck." Finally, consider what the prophet Joel spoke with inspiration from the Lord. "And afterward I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions." What does all that have in common? What should we take from the moving of the Spirit through this scripture this morning? It is in this we see the whole oak tree. From root to rise, we see the importance of the interplay between the many parts that each alone is represented by a generational divide, but all together they create the family of God. The older members are ordained with the message of teaching temperance, self-control, purity, and sound doctrine. But the younger generations are not expected to be silent either, are they? Timothy had a voice, and Paul counseled him to utilize that voice. In Joel's prophecy, we see that the youth would also prophesy and see visions. We see in Joel the inclusivity of God's plan, where both young and old have significant roles in the spiritual community, emphasizing that the Spirit transcends age and generation. We see that everyone should have a voice. The problem begins, however, in how sometimes the older generations in a family or in a church, in other words, those with the strongest voice, choose to incorporate, or on the other hand, fail to incorporate the voices of the younger generation in how we function. Author Hayden Shaw, an expert researcher and lecturer on generational dynamics in organizations, that's a mouthful. He talks about how generations work in groups. Writes in his book, Sticking Points, how to get 4 generations working together in the 12 places they come apart, that the older generations have 4 options when confronted with the differences posed by the younger generations coming up. These are that 1, the older generation can just ignore them. When the next generation is still young and few in number, this is typically the route taken. In other words, why worry about someone with such a small voice? Then, as the next generation grows, invariably the older generation will decide we need to fix them. That's option number 2. This assumes, however, that something about the younger generation is broken, and almost invariably that is a false premise. Here you have the beginning of generational bickering. Words like lazy and slackers get thrown around that are met with derogatory responses like, okay, boomer. In the fixing stage, almost nothing is accomplished but the creation of animosity and distrust. But then when fixing them doesn't work, and the older generation realizes the younger generation is getting stronger, then we move on to the 3rd strategy, cutting a deal. In the workplace, this is where the concept of casual Fridays came from. The generation of the suit and tie cut a deal that would allow polo shirts through the door. Cutting one deal leads to cutting another. In families, we negotiate and compromise. In today's age, that typically means we are compromising over some use of technology and electronics. I can tell you that Bethany and I were shocked when Katie got to high school and we were confronted with not only how pervasive the use of cell phones were, but just how necessary they were as well. Katie had a cell phone entering high school, but our rule was initially that she had to leave it at home. We saw no need for it in the classroom. Until one day Katie forgot her lunch. And Bethany did what our parents might have done 20 years ago. She took her lunch up to the office and asked them to give it to her. But the secretary at the front desk said they wouldn't do that. She told Bethany to text Katie and tell her it was in the office. Well, when Bethany replied that Katie didn't have her cell phone, this was both dumbfounded and apoplectic. She was beside herself. She had no way of notifying Katie herself. Apparently, it was our fault for not letting Katie take her phone to class. At some point along the way, the generation that ran the schools cut a deal with the kids that allowed them to keep their cell phones. And this forced us to have to compromise with Katie on that issue. So what does that mean for the church when we start cutting deals? Because when we cut deals, those deals are not based upon a true appreciation of the needs of the youth balanced against the truths of the church. Those deals are half measures, meant to placate younger generations while allowing the older generations to hang on to power and to cling to the comfort of how things have always been done. And churches have been cutting deals with younger generations for at least 2 or 3 decades or more now. And all that has led to an identity crisis in the church. We have cut deal after deal on what we thought were negotiable issues until we've come to the point in churches in this country where we're just not sure what is non-negotiable anymore. What do I mean by that? Let's be clear on this point. There are some who look at compromise in horror and believe everything is non-negotiable. Then there are others who salivate over compromise and believe that in the interest of comfort and entertainment, nothing is non-negotiable, that everything is up for grabs. Let me also be clear, though, that I am not talking about this congregation. But this congregation can heed this warning. And I'm talking to the older generations now as well. We cannot ignore the younger generation. We know they are not just the future of the church, they are the present as well. We cannot fix them. They are not broken. And cutting deals will not get us where we need to go either. We need to lead. That is the fourth method for dealing with the generational divide. Lead. Provide leadership, not acquiescence. Do not choose the easiest path. Choose the right one. Mark my words. This church, if it embraces the blessings God provides and the growth that God is bringing our way, this church will look different in 20 years. That is the essence of growth. Otherwise, if we try to maintain a death grip on we stagnate and die. But leadership, real leadership, will ensure that the church that is 20 years from now will still be filled with the truth and anchored by the gospel. That is our job today, to provide the gift of the gospel to the church of tomorrow. So what does leadership look like? It's like Jesus. It looks like Jesus. And it begins and ends with love. General Colin Powell took his cue from our Savior when he was asked what it takes to lead an army, and he said this: love your soldiers. But it isn't just love, is it? It is sacrificial love. When the Apostle John set out to describe Jesus' washing of the disciples' feet, he began by acknowledging the power and authority behind the act. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal. Took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. Leaders love with a sacrificial love. They acknowledge their authority and then get up, remove their clothes, wrap a towel around their waist, and are ready to serve. Leaders begin by appreciating the people they want to lead. And the only way you can appreciate someone is first by understanding them. Leadership starts with understanding. After all, how can you serve a person if you do not understand the needs of a person? When you're talking about generational differences, we should stop shaking our heads at what we do not understand, and we should acknowledge that if we were born when they were born and were raised in the same situations that they were raised in, we would think a lot more like they do as well. And this goes for all ages. To be clear, I'm not just talking to one generation now. I'm talking to everyone. Everyone is responsible for leading on the issues of overcoming the generational divide and building a strong, unified body. Youth, you are just as responsible at the age of 16 for trying to understand your parents and grandparents as they are for trying to understand you. And let me say this: you may only be a teenager and as you're a kid, but in this church you have a voice. You have value. You have purpose. And with value and purpose and a voice comes responsibility. Do not forget the responsibility. You have the responsibility to lead too. So then, when we are all ready to lead rather than merely bargain, we can begin having a real honest conversation. And that conversation looks something like this. Any issue we have, we can overcome as a church if we will have a conversation that includes these 5 steps. First, we acknowledge. We acknowledge that on any given issue, there may be honest generational differences, and we talk through those differences. Second, we appreciate the differences. This means we stop talking about what is different, and we focus on why those differences exist. Let me pause here and tell you something which should not surprise you. The differences exist because of technology. In some way, shape, or form, the advancement of technology is responsible for nearly every aspect of our generational differences. From the invention of the refrigerator and the television to TikTok and artificial intelligence, technology moves us forward and shapes how your generation relates to the world and completely transforms your children and grandchildren and the world they will ever know. I'm from Generation X, in case you didn't know. And researchers point out, oh, yeah, Generation X. Researchers point out that our generation had the last analog childhood and the first digital adolescence. Mine was the last generation to record mixtapes from the radio and the first to download music from the internet. Mine was the last to go riding bikes all day long until the street light came on, and the first to discover the dangers of getting lost on the internet with strangers. Every generation since the dawn of the 20th century has experienced some fundamental change in who we grew up to be, because there was a fundamental change in how the church, how the world lived and functioned, did its business, and was entertained. By now we know that technology is not a boogeyman. It's a reality. Every technological advance has positive effects and it has negative effects. To appreciate the people we do life with, we have to stop resenting their differences, and we have to start understanding why those differences exist. So 2, appreciate. 3, reflect. We learn how to accommodate other approaches to an issue. This is not cutting a deal or compromise for the sake of compromise. Flexing means, in the context of the family, determine which rules you have are a necessity for the health and safety and well-being of your family, and which rules are just merely preference. In the context of church, it means determining whether our stance on an issue is based on scriptural, biblical mandate, or honestly acknowledging that sometimes a thing is just a matter of preference. These are tough discussions to be had, whether it is amongst the family or in the midst of a church. But we have to stop cutting deals, church. Because cutting deals is just giving up something you think you can live without, and doing so without reference to why we did that thing in the first place. If we cannot admit to what is just a matter of preference, we lose trust. If we cannot hold to what is a matter of scriptural importance, we lose truth. And both truth and trust are 2 things we cannot do without. Number 4, as part of our conversation, we must learn to leverage the strengths of each generation for the benefit of the family or for the benefit of the church. Last week, after I made a statement that 2 people cannot complete each other, I heard from several people that God will bring 2 people together who have different strengths and different weaknesses, thus ensuring a stronger marriage as a whole. I do not disagree. So then you should agree today that if we are all exactly alike, we would be boring and we would be weak. We can maximize our differences and leverage those differences to make us a stronger body. Paul says we should all be speaking the same gospel in 1 Corinthians 1:10, and should therefore be, quote, perfectly united in mind and thought. Amen? And 12 chapters later, in the same letter, Paul acknowledges that everyone is different. And these differences contribute to the strength and functioning of the whole body. We say the same thing, but in different ways. This applies not just to the different spiritual gifts each person brings, but to the unique experiences each person has collected to enrich us all as a whole. Acknowledge our differences, appreciate our differences, and then we put those differences to work. Finally, point 5, we have to resolve our differences. There will be issues where it is a matter of preference alone But we honestly find that we cannot accommodate every preference. In some instances, it just won't be feasible to do so. In those instances where preferences collide, we will need to find resolutions. But this requires everyone working together. Some will have to give a little, some a lot. That is leadership from all angles. Remember that important thing called trust? If we're going to try and resolve an issue where there has been no trust established first, then that is not leadership. That is merely telling one viewpoint to accommodate another, and it will fail us on so many levels. Leadership requires understanding, trust, and above all, sacrifice. That is the goal set before us now. That is the conversation that is now open to all. Now, with all that said, I feel I should commend this church for the work that you have already done to build toward a future. You have already been working diligently to provide the gift of the gospel to the church of tomorrow. Allow me to point out some of your successes. Look and pay attention to who is in the AV booth right now. Look at your bulletin and give recognition to the names serving at the Lord's table, praying, and certainly we should recognize who's singing today. Gio, you're doing an excellent job, brother. Yes. These are folks who are just beginning to embark on their own personal faith journeys or have just done so recently. But they not only choose to be here as a part of us, but they choose to serve and choose to bring their friends as well. This demonstrates the commitment of everyone in this church to building a diverse and unified body that is open and welcoming to all. On this day, commit to this conversation. Commit to lead. Commit to the future of the church. God has a future. God always has a future. Will we be a part of it?